The Lord be with you. We're not doing too well for ourselves. Now that the earwax is out, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, testing 1, 2, 3, 4. That's going to work. Whoa. I did not believe that this little recorder would cause feedback, but you live and you learn. The Lord be with you. And let us pray. Merciful and gracious Lord, we give you thanks for all the blessings that are upon us this day. We thank you for hearing us as we pray for those whom we love and about whom we care. We thank you for hearing those that we pray for who've asked for our prayers. And we thank you now for this gathering. Let your Spirit descend upon us and excite us with the good news of the gospel. In Christ's name, amen. I said last week we were going to spend this whole session on Beit Shean, and then as I was working and preparing, I said to myself, we can't go riding right on past Megiddo, which is below Beit Shean by a few miles, so I stuck it in the past. In the end of the session, and in fact we pay a little bit for that because we could have spent more time at Megiddo. But I think the points we need to make can be made, and we can do both so that we can finally get to the outskirts, the suburbs of Jerusalem next week, and talk about Bethany, the point of Lazarus being raised from the dead, and then about Jerusalem and the early questions about Jerusalem. Following week, we'll talk about Calvary. Where is it? Is it here? Is it there? And it probably doesn't make any difference. What we believe is Jesus was raised from the dead, and we don't care where it happened. But at any rate, we'll talk about that place and so forth. So just to look ahead just a little bit. Today, I want you to keep in mind the things we've been saying all through these sessions about the Holy Land being a land bridge. As I told you before, the Arabs have a saying, we were born in war and we'll die in war. Now they've had that saying a long time before there was the Gslc Strip, a long time before there was this issue. There has been war virtually the entire civilized history of the Holy Land. Now that's a contradiction, because why would there be war in a civilized period? But nonetheless, since there have been settlements, there have been the issues of access. Again, to remind us, geographically on one side, on the east side of the Holy Land, there's largely the desert area with the exception of some part of Jordan. Then after that you're into the Sahara Desert, you're into Arabia. So that the whole point is that's not really travelable area. By the same token, on the west side is the Mediterranean Ocean. So you've got this strip of land so narrow for the Israelis that they can't turn a jet around in their airspace. Okay, that's how narrow what we call the Holy Land is. They have to go out over the Mediterranean, which theoretically doesn't belong to anybody, but in history we know it belongs to the strongest person who's out there. But at any rate, they can't turn a U-turn in their land space most of the time. So at any rate, this idea of the land bridge between Africa to the south and Asia and Europe to the north is just part of this place's history. And because of that, it's desirable territory. In peacetime, you collect the tolls of the caravans. In wartime, you establish your military bases. You would much rather defend an area 100 miles wide than thousands of miles wide. So this is the place to be. Whether you want to stop the nations of the north coming south, or whether the nations of the north want to stop the African nations, Egypt particularly, from coming north, you want to be here. This is where you want your forts. This is where you want to fight. This is where you want to roll your chariots out and encounter the enemy. And you will see that in the two places we talk about today as just the rotation. In fact, I'll try to stay pretty close to my notes, which is difficult because, one, it's complicated, and two, I can't read it anyway. But I'll try to stay close to my notes because this rotation of ownership and government is constant in Beit Shean and in Megiddo. Megiddo has 20, some say 26 levels of occupation. That means destroyed and rebuilt 20 times or 26 times. And the mountain keeps getting higher. The first page, the picture on the first page is Beit Shean, or Beth Shean, the home of Shean. The Beit Shean Tel is behind us here, and that thing is about 900 and some feet tall. So it doesn't look that tall here, but trust me, it is. There are two pathways in this photograph going up, one that has landings on it for old people like me, and others just a stairway going right on up. How many here saw Jesus Christ Superstar ever, the movie? Okay. If you'll look over to the left of the top of the mound, you'll see what looks like a scar on the picture, but it's that tree that was the cross in Jesus Christ Superstar is right at the left on that. Can you see it? Yeah, it's just barely visible, and it's still there from the movie production, but it is a tree, and it is at Beit Shean. The city below is actually a 3rd century on into the 1st century Roman city. It was the capital of the Decapolis. Remember the 10 cities we talked about? 10 Roman cities. This was the capital of the Decapolis for a period of time. It was the only Decapolis city on the west side of the Jordan, and it was the capital of those 10 cities. Polis, P-O-L-I-S, is Latin for city, and decap, 10. So you have the Decapolis, the 10 cities, 10 Roman cities, and this was one of them. It is a delightful place. It's gradually, this picture is now dated. It's much more of it is raised up than lying down. It's probably one of the most reconstructed of all the sites in the Holy Land, and because of the space it takes on the page, I haven't been able to show very much of it. Let me get to page 2. And the second picture on page 2 shows the lower city from the top of the Tel. Now, you don't get on the top of the Tel very often because the tour guides will all tell you there's nothing much up there. They lie. But the fact of the matter is they're in a hurry. They don't want 30 people trekking up the Tel and getting lost up there and then not coming down. So they say, well, you can go up if you want to. I'll give you 15 minutes. Well, look at the Tel again and think going up there 15 minutes, seeing anything coming down. So very few people go to the top of the Tel. But from the Tel looking down, you see this huge city of Beit Shean. It was later changed to Scapolis, remembering the group of people who refounded it during the Hellenistic period. That we're talking about before Jesus, but in the aftermath of Alexander the Great, the Greek, who conquered this whole area. And then it fell, whenever a big king dies, everything goes into chaos as there is the scramble for people under him to become governors of a part of his empire. When Alexander died, that happened. And a fellow by the name of Antiochus, who also gave himself the name Epiphanes, which is to suggest God revealed, which if he had any chance with the Jews, the word Epiphanes ended that chance. Antiochus Epiphanes III inherits a piece of Alexander's kingdom, and so we have this Hellenistic period beginning about 300 BCE, before the Common Era, and it was resettled by Greeks and given that new name. Because of Antiochus Epiphanes and his abominations, both of his own stature and of the temple itself, sacrificing unclean animals in the temple, the Hasmoneans revolted under the Maccabean family. If it hadn't been for George Friedrich Handel, most people would have never heard of the Maccabean rebellion, but George Friedrich Handel did a marvelous oratorio, much like the Messiah, and I probably prefer the Hallelujah chorus in the Maccabean rebellion by Handel than I do maybe the one in the Messiah. But at any rate, Judas Maccabeus leads the rebellion. Maccabeus means hammer, and these were tough people. It was a priestly family, and Judas is one of the leaders. A good Judas is one of the leaders, and they win. And the Jews then enjoy almost 100 years of sovereignty in their own land again, and until the Romans come in about 64. Do you get the feeling about this land bridge thing already? Well, let me tell you. Sescophalos right here was occupied most of the time by Egyptian forces. But not all the time, because when the Assyrians came through in 722, they leveled it. And then the Egyptians came back again. The Egyptians came during Solomon's time and Rehoboam's time, Solomon's son, and they occupied this and Megiddo as well. So this has been as much Egyptian as been anything. And all kinds of calling cards of the Egyptians are there. But it is one of the major areas. Now, just as we've said before, and I know I'm repeating myself, but these are sites where they're directly applicable. Both at Beit Shean and Megiddo, they're in major intersection areas. Beit Shean is in a valley area of the Jordan and the Habar River, and it kind of cuts over to the seacoast so that you have a road to the Mediterranean. It would intersect with I'll think about it in a minute. I want to say, well, it could have been actually, with the Solomon seaport. But at any rate, that gave us now again with what goes north and south along the river and then curves inland, north and south. What was it called? Via Maris. Okay, that thing we've been hearing about every place we stop. It was not always called the Via Maris. It was the way of the sea. Via Maris is what the Romans named it because it's Latin for Via Maris is Latin for way of the sea. So the Romans actually gave it the name that stuck, but it was there 1,000 years or more before the Romans ever came. And it was that section from Egypt all the way up into Damascus and then into Asia. But this is at one of those crossroads. So Beit Shean becomes a very significant political and military station. And remains that through much of its life. It actually survives until a major earthquake in the 8th century levels it. But off and on, there are periods when it's been destroyed, leveled to the ground. David leveled it to the ground, not Solomon. David leveled it to the ground and burned it, just left ashes. And then Solomon rebuilt it and stationed military people there in a forward administrative center. In 722, the Assyrians come down and they leveled it again. The Egyptians by then had taken it over again. So back and forth this has gone all along. It was at this location and Megiddo that we find, as I've mentioned last week, the anthropomorphic coffin lids that look like you're sleeping there, just all carved in the lid. Hundreds of them were found at Megiddo and at Beit Shean, which indicates the presence of the Egyptians. In addition to that, James Pritchett, who I suspect is now no longer alive, was the archaeologist that discovered them in both of these places. took them home. They're, most of them, at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, but they've never been on public display since before World War I. And so you can go there, but you won't see any of them. The result of that, by the way, was that James Pritchard was banned when Israel came into existence from digging in the Holy Land. And so he was still alive then, but probably no longer interested. Anyway, so we have this flow back and forth. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians have all claimed this city as their own. Any questions about that? Yes?
Is there a somewhat abbreviated answer why this area, regardless of the religion other than Christian, including through today, that they have to go in and kill everybody, man, woman, child, dog, chicken, when whoever it is, has decided they should arrive there? That has beat me. Why even...
Simple answer, that's what ancient cultures did, all of them. And if you lived at all, they took you out to another place and put their people in so that the nation can't be reconstituted. So it was either killing them or transporting them. They all did it. Just a military form of possessing a land in such a fashion that that nation cannot revive again.
So there's not a whole lot of hope they're going to change their ideas.
Well, if you remember, it was last week or the week before that I said one of the issues at the Middle East is that it doesn't understand a gray area. It doesn't understand, therefore, compromise. It doesn't understand accepting anything except my position. It's black or white or the highway, as we might say. And that's been true from nearly the very beginning of written history in that area. So that's some of it. It is in days. And the Arab saying, we were born in war and we die in war, actually, Beirut, Lebanon was burning when this gentleman told me about it. He had been the chief of security for the Jordanian government in what we call the Holy Land, and when in the '67 war the Israelis conquered that area, they had no use for a Jordanian CIA executive, so he was leading tours. But he was a very intelligent man and very knowledgeable, and he said, we were born in war and we die in war, and that's just the way it is here. But it seems like it's sort of foreordained. The land bridge is the first thing. And then when the airplane was invented, you could begin to say, you no longer needed the air bridge, the land bridge anymore. You can simply fly over it. And but the exception is that in order to fly over it, you need oil, and the Arabs had oil, and the Soviets had most of the Arabs. So it was just the issue of the Cold War got replayed in the Holy Land between the Western powers and it just seemed, and he said, it just seems like it's foreordained, it just repeats itself. That's a longer answer than you wanted, but the fact is it really is ingrained in ancient culture. So, and let me just go here and then run. In recent wars in which we have been involved, there have been instances when we exterminated a village. So think Vietnam. So the end result is when you're fighting an enemy that you can't subdue any other way, that's one of the ways. You don't know who the good guys or the bad guys are, so you get extreme. And if to understand that, maybe you have to be the one being shot at to understand that, but nonetheless. Well, at any rate, what you see, Beit Shean comes up several times in the biblical record. Probably the most exciting or most significant time is when Joshua tells us, as you'll see in the footnotes, Joshua tells us that they could not push the Philistines or the Canaanites out of Beit Shean. they could not capture Beit Shean. Same was true to some degree in Megiddo until the time of David. And David supposedly captures it as he does Megiddo. But the Canaanites, the Philistines, stay in the area. They simply move down to the coastal areas, which again the Israelites never fully possessed. And so there was always unrest. You remember they had the same story at Tel Dan a few weeks ago, similar kind of things. So, at any rate, Tel Bet Shean, as you see its height, you can understand again we're talking about more than 20 levels of occupation on this Tel of Beit Shean. And you can see it now because this new Roman city is at the base of it. Why would they build a city at the base where we've talked about the necessity to protect yourself was on top of the mountain? Think a little bit. Why did they build this massive city? I have some pictures that show you how high the civilization was. I have a picture of a huge latrine here, just on the other side of these columns, with running water to flush the trenches out, and then a swimming pool in the latrine area. I'm not sure I'd want to go swimming in a latrine, but remarkable level of culture and civilization. That latrine area, by the way, is right by the amphitheater, which I guess that's convenient. So that at any rate, it's a remarkable place. Kirk was there with me one time. It's altogether a new scene now, such as the latrine. But in the center of the city, they had a huge, I want to say huge by as wide as this room, fountain just gushing with water into a pool in the center of town. And the water is coming from the Hamak River, which is down a rather steep valley even from here. Had to get up that much water up the hill to flush the latrine, to run a fountain, to do all these kind of things. And I don't know. Did they have a what do they call it? A water pump? Water ram. Was that technology? I would suspect something like that was what they used, but they had to raise the water a long way. And it wasn't just carried by a chain gang of slaves having buckets. It was somehow moved very efficiently and in great amounts of water. Why did they build it down on the level land instead of on top of the hill? There are two reasons that are immediately obvious. Okay, yeah, Elizabeth. There wasn't enough room on the top of the mountain to start with. It was a much bigger city. So there just wasn't room there. Second thing, these are the days of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Nobody in the Mediterranean world tried to cause serious trouble for the Romans, except the Jews. They tried it a couple times. But most people in general would not do that because the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, served everybody. As long as there are no armies coming unless they're friends, and since Rome owns all this by now, there's nobody else to worry about. So we build a sucker down here. There would be times when there were, but generally speaking, not. So it was safe now to build on the lower level of the terrain. If you look to the left of the mound, you can't see it, but to the left of the mound, and in photographs, you almost think you can touch it, is Mount Gilboa. Anybody remember Mount Gilboa? Mount Gilboa. Mount Gilboa is where Saul and Jonathan and his other two sons were all killed in a battle with the Philistines to try to capture Beit Shean. And it's right next to it. It has a nice, at the it has a nice flat top like it's a tell, although it's actually a mountain. And the Philistines just crunched Saul. And Saul and his 3 sons were killed in that battle. And the next day when they went back to strip the dead, because, things were not all that plentiful, so once you went back the day after the battle to strip the dead, you got uniforms, you got armor, you got all kinds of things. And when they discovered they had King Saul himself dead, along with his armor bearers and his 3 sons, they beheaded Saul and carried the 3 sons. Have you heard about beheading anywhere lately? Some things never changed. They beheaded Saul and took Saul and his 3 sons and nailed them to the walls of Beit Shean. Now remember, there would have been walls around this tell. This lower city wouldn't have been here. We're talking about the 900s BCE. They nailed Saul, and the second page has a painting of the Israelites coming by night. When they found out what had happened to their king, they came by night and removed the king and his 3 sons from the walls of Beit Shean. So Mount Gilboa is famous in biblical history. It's famous in religious history because it was the point at which the first king of Israel was slain, of the Israelites was slain. And so Beit Shean has that kind of infamous history. And who will take over now that Saul is dead? Come on. Who? David, right. David takes over, and David is the eminent warrior king, and Saul apparently wasn't all that bad. And David will be followed by his son Jeroboam, and after that he'll be followed by Ahab. Now, you won't remember Ahab, but you'll remember his wife. Who is Ahab's wife? Jezebel. Anybody know who Jezebel is? Abraham's wife, okay. Jezebel was the queen, the Baal queen, who confronted Elijah on Mount Carmel. She never confronted him, but you remember the story? I'm getting off text a little bit, but remember the story? There's been this large famine in the land, and we have the story of the widow of Zarephath, whose son is saved by Elijah. He says to her, as the Lord says, bake a cake for me and for your son and your cruse of oil and wheat will not be expended until the plague is over. And she says, oh man, you're nuts. I mean, I got enough for one cake and that's what I'm going to, and then we'll die. And he said, make the cake first for me. And she does, and nobody dies. Well, the son dies, and Elijah goes, takes the son and puts him on a bed and lays on top of him and says, Lord, you asked this woman to help me, and she did, and now her son dies. What kind of deal is this? And he comes back to life. At any rate, this is the widow of Zarephath's story. And so then Elijah goes on Mount Carmel, which was a high holy place for both Baal shrines and Hebrew shrines. And Elijah goes to Mount Carmel, and there are 450 Baal prophets. And Elijah challenges the 450 Baal prophets who took their meals at Jezebel's table in the palace. He challenges those 450 priests to a duel. He said, let's build an altar, and we'll put a sacrifice on the altar, and you call upon Baal to consume the sacrifice, and then we'll know who the God is. And if it doesn't happen, I'll call on my God. So all day long these guys are dancing and shelling, and Elijah's leaning against a tree. And in one of the passages that's translated in good taste in the Old Testament says, yell louder, maybe he's indisposed, meaning maybe he's in the latrine and is not hearing you. And Elijah just taunting them to death. And finally they're just on the ground, exhausted. And he calls for a new lamb. He calls for water to be poured over the altar. He calls for a trench to be dug around the altar to be filled with water. And then he calls upon God and Yahweh and the Israelite God. And fire comes and consumes the whole altar, the water, and the lamb. And then he orders that the 450 Baal prophets be slain, gathered up and slain, and they were, right on the top of Mount Carmel. When Jezebel gets the news, she sends a message to him that I swear by the time the sun sets tomorrow it will be for you in the streets as it is for my Baal prophets, and the dogs will consume you. Well, you know, 450 Baal prophets didn't bother Elijah at all, apparently, but one angry woman scared the daylights out of him. And he took the lamb to the south, and he didn't stop running till he got to Mount Sinai, back to where our roots are. Mount Horeb, it says in that tradition. And that's all here on Mount Carmel, which is sandwiched in the same region of Beit Shean, Megiddo, and so forth. So that this all happens at Mount Carmel. Any questions about that digression? But what we're saying, yes, Karen.
Just so you know, you probably already know, Mendelssohn also set Elijah.
I know he did. I'm not such a fan of Elijah. Judas Maccabeus is worth listening to.
I haven't done Maccabeus, but
You got to hear that. Surely somebody has recorded it. I would never have heard it. So at any rate, yeah, you're right.
It's powerful.
Yeah.
It's powerful when the choir is singing, "Come, gods of Baal."
Yeah. Oh, yes, that whole sequence is sung out. Right.
Competition,
Yeah.
and the taunting. It's quite good.
And I think the funniest line is, you see Elijah leaning against a tree just taunting him. Maybe he's in the John, maybe he can't hear you. Yell louder. It's just a delightful story. Back again to something we said very early in this series and before in other series. These stories have been told for generations and generations. We talked about the Indians in Arizona having a storyteller who was higher social status than anybody else in the tribe, who told the tribal stories. Well, what I just repeated to you is a tribal story. There is some element, no doubt, of truth to it, but it's been embellished a little bit. Maybe the latrine line is an embellishment, I don't know. But the point is, there's this competition, and it's finally Jezebel who ends up being eaten by the dogs. Elijah in the story, as the story gets told, I might as well go on a little bit, it's just full of color. As Elijah gets first to Beersheba, and he's about halfway to Horeb, he gets to Beersheba, and the Lord comes to him in the night and says, Elijah, what are you doing here? And he says to God, well, I'm coming from your land, and I think everybody's against you, just me is standing for you, and right at the moment I'm not real sure about you. so he's telling it how it goes down there. The story is just a marvelous story. Then he gets to Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, and God sends him back and tells him who to look for, and it goes on from there. But all this is wrapped up together in about the same time period that we're talking about now. So then, of course, David burns Beth Shean to the ground because of their defiling Saul, and then Solomon, David's son, rebuilds it to significant grandeur, makes it an administrative center, and stations a major military contingent there because it's an intersection of two important roads. Any more about Beit Shean? Fabulous place, and but what we look at, what's so awesome with these re-erected ruins from the Roman city that flourished until the Muslim invasion, the Islamic invasion of the 5th and 6th centuries, and then they destroyed it, but then they rebuilt it, and they allowed, it was then by then a virtually 100% Christian city, and they allowed them to continue to worship there, and they did well. Later, when the Egyptians came back, they never seemed to go away, do they? When the Egyptians came back, they now are Islamic too, and they were not as hospitable to the Christians, although they did not push them out, they did not kill them, they did not behead them, but there were the taxes and other kind of things. Let's go on to Megiddo, and I want to talk a little bit about what we're looking at here. First of all, this is a model of the mound, the tell at Megiddo, from the early Iron Age, right? Pretty much the intersection of Bronze and Iron Age. Look at the very top of the tell at about 1230, right around the top of the tell. That's the king's palace. Now, these cities were so large, not everybody lived in the city. In peacetime, the people were tilling the fields out around this tell, so they only came and lived in the tell when they needed the protection of the walls. But this is the king's palace. The governor of the town this big was called a king in those days. And so all these big cities had their own kings, and they had a little turf around that they ruled as a nation. So the king's palace would be right here. Ahab would have lived in this palace. I have some photographs in the mound of what archaeologists believe was Ahab's palace. Remember, Ahab is the king of the northern kingdom now, since Jeroboam and Rehoboam split the kingdom. Then you'll notice two structures that look identical at the bottom, 6 and 7 o'clock. Do you see them? They're thought to be Solomon's, Jeroboam's, and Ahab's stables. Those two buildings would have housed 600 horses or so. And the Bible tells us that Solomon had in total more than 1,000 horses and 1,400 chariots. In fact, one Old Testament book said he had 40,000 horses. Now, nobody believed that when form criticism came into being in the 18th century, mostly by German biblical scholars. Nobody believed that for simply logistic reasons. Anybody can think of the logistic reason with 40,000 horses? The hay burners, that's the first thing. So you need a boatload of hay. Where are you going to get it?
What do you do with excrements?
Yeah, who's going to shovel out the barn? All right, that's another issue. That's like, Bill Cosby's Noah, when he gets God on the line and says, have you looked in the bottom of this boat? Who's going to shovel this out? So anyway, but the other thing is water. Horses are not only major hay burners, big appetites, but they're also major water consumers. So to have 40,000 horses, and so the answer is this. He had 40,000 horses perhaps, or 4,000 if it's a textual copying area. I'll accept either one. And I don't much care about which one you pick. The issue is you don't have them all in the same place, number one. You have about 600 or so, plus or minus, at each of your 3 chariot cities, which gives you a total of how many horses? 600 times 3? 1,800 horses. You've got 900 horses at Gezer, G-E-Z-E-R. You've got 900 horses at Hazor, H-A-Z-O-R. And you've got 900 horses at Megiddo. And you've probably got 500 chariots. Okay? Now, they show in pictures, particularly in Ben-Hur and other things, that a chariot's been driven by 6 or even 12 horses. And that's nice to think about, but it's not terribly maneuverable. If you need to turn sharp corners, one horse is going to do that, not 2 or 3 or 4. So if you have 900 horses and 500 chariots, you have enough horses to fight a second day. All right? And the others are thought to have been in the neighborhood of Jerusalem, where you breed your horses, where you train your horses. You don't do that at an advanced post. You prepare your war machinery at a back area, probably Jerusalem, and then you would have had another, if you got 4,000, you'd have had another 1,200 or 1,500 horses back in the staging area. Am I making any sense to you at all? Okay. Well, Megiddo is one of the 3 chariot cities. And that meant you had a sizable military detachment here with 500 to 800 horses, 500 or so chariots, the men to drive the chariots, the people to care for the horses, the moving of the hay, the securing of the water. I mean, we're talking about a major contingent. And the German who came upon form criticism says, it's not possible. You know, this is just biblical exaggeration. It can't be done. Well, once this was undug, we begin to say, by God, he had very nearly 600 or more horses at Megiddo. What you have in these 2 buildings are the roof is held up by 2 posts, 2 rows of posts going down, holding this roof up. On each side of the post, there were mangers and tethering holes. At each side of the manger would tether 1 horse. Each end of the manger would tether 1 horse. And on the other side of that same row, you'd tether 2 more horses. So each manger has 4 horses. You can do the math. And the manger is mostly still there. Now, at points of embarrassment, when I would take a group to the Holy Land, I always required they attend 3 long sessions on the Holy Land. Because one of the early ones I led, we had a wonderful, dear old lady who's listened to the whole presentation from the guide, or she hadn't listened. We're at Megiddo, and we're standing by one of these mangers. How big is the manger, by the way? 9-year-old boy can lay in the manger and stretch out. All right? So she's standing by one of these perfectly hewn mangers, and she's saying, is this made out of concrete? And I want to, oh God, don't tell me. And the guide kind of rolled his eyes and said, no ma'am, everything here is made out of stone. We have a lot of it. And concrete did not come into the scene for a long time after this period. Though King Herod, when he built Caesarea Maritima on the coast to build a protected harbor, used hydraulic concrete. He actually, this is 40 years before the birth of Christ, he actually built footings for an enclosed harbor, filled them with stones, poured them over with hydraulic concrete, and sank them, and the concrete's still there. You know, and how did he get it down there? Well, he first sank the forms with stones, so the forms sank, and then with the rocks in them, and then he put the hydraulic concrete in the forms, and it hardened, and they're still there. That was the footer in the Mediterranean for the harbor that would hold warehouses and piers and all this kind of stuff. Amazing. Nobody knew they knew how to do that in the 40 years before Christ, but they knew about hydraulic cement. Anyhow, in these 2 stables, you can add up somewhere between 600 and 650 horses were on Megiddo in those 2 stations right there. So that Solomon, Jeroboam, and later Ahab had those stables. So those horses were probably, the numbers in one book of 4,000, the other book of 40,000. The one is probably an exaggeration, but the 4,000 is altogether now believable because the same foundations are at Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer. Where is Gezer? Gezer is almost all the way out to the water's edge near the Mediterranean, down at the bottom of the Dead Sea. Go on out, pitch a straight line, and you'll find Gezer. Go up above the Galilee to the line with Lebanon now, near Dan, and you'll find Hatzor. The cities are at major intersections. Every invasion from Asia came right down the Jordan Valley. So you put a major chariot city at the top of your country in the Jordan Valley. That's Hatzor. The Egyptians are always coming up by the way of the sea, so by the way of the sea, you plant Gezer, chariot city. And then at Megiddo, it's already established, but you build then a heavily fortified chariot city at Megiddo. And you have in reserve 500 chariots, 1,500 chariots, say whatever, and the horses to pull them for a 2 to 3 day battle. Are you with me so far? I'm jumping at this a little bit. Questions? And you remember my answer last week when somebody asked where they got the horses. Well, they went to the Chicotine Drives here on the East Coast. Actually, horses have been a part of military operations since the beginning of recorded military history. They've been around a long time. Maybe they don't look exactly like ours, but they've been around a long time. Now let's move on to Megiddo. I want to go back at the far right. You'll see the gate of Megiddo, and I want to come back and talk about that. But you can notice as we talk this ramp that's coming uphill to that gate. Do you see what I'm talking about on the mound here, page 3? The gate is up at the top. We'll talk about that gate in a little bit. Not very long. I'm running out of time. The whole tell of Megiddo is not dug. It's 33 acres big. So, you remember the archaeological statement, dig, dug, gone. Once it's dug, you can never redig it. You can never redig it for later generations with more astute scientific ways of exploring a tell. So you purposely don't dig a whole tell. And the object is not to re-erect a city so we can all go back as tourists and see what it once looked like. The object is academic. The object is to show what they find, but not to, and sometimes to rebuild it. There's not much trouble rebuilding Beit Shean in its later iteration because it's on the level ground. There is no tell. So is this round object on page 3. This is a Canaanite altar, all kinds of sacrificial bones around it of the unfortunate animals, a staircase coming up the front on the left side, open stones, no cement or other kind of fill. Why would that be? It's a sacrificial altar. Why would it be open so the blood can go through? Exactly. So that they would sacrifice here and so blood goes through. That's dated by virtual consensus of all archaeologists who worked this mound, 3000 BCE. And it is on bedrock. So there's no further to go because that structure is on bedrock. Now look above it and you'll see this square mound of dirt with a palm tree planted in the middle of it. That's partially to hold the mound together with its root system. But that's how deep they had to dig in the mound to get to this 3000 BC altar. Are you following what I'm saying? If you don't think archaeologically, it may not be as evident as it is to some of us who struggle with it. 3000 BC, it's on bedrock, so but the actual area was settled by people less urbanized as early as 4000 BC. That's 4,000 years before Christ, or 6,000 years ago. And when we talk about Jericho, when we get through with Jerusalem, we'll talk about Jericho being the oldest known urban city in the world. And it'll go about 7,000 to 8,000 years before Christ. Okay, The next thing I want to call your attention to is this little doll over on the right. I don't have any text related to this doll, so listen up. This is called an execration text. When you had an enemy upon whom you wished all hell to break loose, you would write a curse on this doll, okay? And then either leave it on your mantelpiece or dash it to the ground so that the curse would come true. It's a little like voodoo dolls. Dolls you stick a pin in and hope that the other guy can feel it, okay? Well, this was, and we're talking now, these were found both at Megiddo and Beit Shean. Again, that tells us Egyptians must have been here because this is Egyptian culture kind of stuff. So they left all kinds of tags of their presence there. Turn the page, if you will, with me. After 586, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians and the people taken into exile, all active, serious colonization of Megiddo stopped. There was never any major rebuilding of Megiddo. There were some small towns on top, but not major rebuilding. So that left us with some surprisingly intact ruins. And the top picture is the Megiddo Late Bronze Gate. And if you count with me, you will see that there are, come down the center roadway coming in the gate, and you will see that there's 1, 2 enclaves in like this. This would be a Bronze Age gate. Bronze Age, 3,000 to, 1,500 to 1,000 BCE. This is a Bronze Age gate. This gate would have been 3 stories tall. And I apologize that mound picture doesn't show you that very well, the tell picture. You see it's a major building there. But here's how it was actually built. The Iron Age improved on the idea. The Iron Age had the long ramp coming up. You can see that on the picture, the model of the mound. You see the long ramp coming. It's relatively steep. It's relatively steep. And here's the first gate right here, as you see the dotted line begin. And you have to batter that gate down. Well, in ancient times, they would do that with a battering ram, and it was not too difficult. In these 2 recesses here would be archers who attacked the chariot. Now, what does this tell us? You got to go in this gate one at a time. All right? You're coming up the hill. That might have slowed down your horse a little bit, but what's going to really slow your horse down is once you're in that gate, you got to get over the guys that were killed that went through the gate originally. And then you've got to turn a left angle, in this case, a left-hand turn, almost 90 degrees, and again batter down a gate and then go through 3 of those enclaves. It was 3 stories tall because there were 3 levels of these enclaves. So therefore, there's 6 here, so there's 9 archers' enclaves up that gate. Are you with me? Talk about running the gauntlet, as some people talk about. 2 things happen. Even if they get up their speed a little bit as they start through the gate, somebody's going to hit 1 or 2 of them, and you've got to drag them out of the way before anybody else can go in. Are you with me? It's an almost impregnable gate for the Iron Age. Now, I'll tell you a story. Gslc, the late Gslc, a famed general of the Israeli Defense Forces in the War for Independence and the 67 War, was also a gifted archaeologist. He had dug Gezer. He had dug again at Megiddo to further identify the gates there. And he was working on Hatzor to the north. They found a casement wall. A casement wall was a zigzag wall like this. It would be, and inside where it zagged out, there could be shops. and that kind of thing. But it was a wall, 2 walls actually, filled with dirt in between them. So if you tried to run a ramrod against the wall, all you did was pack the dirt, and the stones didn't fall usually. So there was almost no way except to scale the wall, which was costly in deaths of your crew. At any rate, at Hatzor, there was a casement wall going around the city, joining to the gate. They couldn't find the gate. They're doing spot digs and coming up with nothing. And Yadin went with his cane. He had ward injuries and all that. Went with his cane, and he started at the end of the wall, and he took so many paces, stuck the cane in the ground and said, dig there. And within 4 shovelfuls, they had hit the gate. Not only do these 3 chariot cities have the same architecture, they probably had the same architect, and they measure almost identically. So that in those 3 chariot cities, we have Stone Age gates, 3 chambers instead of 2, and much larger substances. Kind of an interesting story about it all. And all of this is because the Egyptians keep coming back, the Assyrians come down, the Babylonians come down, just the big names that you already know. Thank you all very much. I don't have to get to church straight now, but I'm out of material. Next week, yes, sir.
Sorry, not that you might answer the question here, but I've been thinking about a lot of things here. A few questions. And
Well, if you have a lot of things, let the rest go, and then I'll talk to you.
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
Because I think a lot of people involved are looking at the current structure.
So thank you all very much. Next week, we will do Bethany, the home of Lazarus, and the environs of Jerusalem.
Acumen of the people to build these kind of structures.
I'm sorry.
Time. I said the one was involving the labor force and the acumen of these people to build these things and with their occupations. Then I've also been thinking, I come from a place very close to Great Zimbabwe ruins, which is a structure when you look at the gate here.
Excuse me just a minute.
Temple, the Acropolis.
I just want to tell you I'm on my way to the Holy Lands with Michelle this week. And thank you for these sessions, because when Dr. Luker sent the homework, I already knew the answers.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thank
Anyway,
you.
good luck on your trip.
Well, thank you.
Have a good week.
Good to have you. I'm glad you're feeling good.
Won't see you next week.
All right.
Thank
you.
I would like someone like you involved in these studies to go and look at the Great Zimbabwe ruins